All right, I'm back. I'll start. We're Facebook living right now. Want to
All
say
right.
hi to everybody here.
Hello.
Start admitting people and welcome everybody to a Freethinkers Corner. Our next in our series, our Pharaoh Feb or Fantasy Romance February author series. Today we have Jeffe, correct? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes. Yes.
Jeffe Kennedy. Um, And before we do get going, I want to just remind everybody that we're going to keep everybody's videos and mics muted just to keep down any confusion. And but if you do have a question or comment, if you're on Facebook Live, use the comment section. If you're on us with us Zoom, again, use the chat feature there, and we will. I'll either relay it or Jeffy will answer your question. So, again, we have Jeffe Kennedy, and she's the author of many novels. And actually, I was going to read this so that I get it all correct. Um, Award-winning author whose works include novels, nonfiction, poetry, short fiction. She's won the prestigious RITA Award from the Romance Writers of America, has been a finalist twice, been a UCross Foundation Fellow, received the Wyoming Arts Council Fellowship for Poetry, was awarded the Frank Nicholson Doubleday Memorial Award, and she serves on the board of directors for the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America as a director at large. Whew, that's a lot of stuff. So, welcome to our version of Fantasy Romance February.
Thank you very much.
So let's get right started because we have a lot that I'd like to cover because you do have a lot of books out there. Um, so let's start with how did you become involved with writing fantasy romance? What was your influences on that?
Uh, I grew up reading all kinds of science fiction and fantasy. I read that first. Anne McCaffrey was my gateway drug to fantasy. And then later, I discovered romance and found all of the fantastic things about romance that I wanted the two to intersect. I wanted this like Anne McCaffrey-esque fantastic female driven strong protagonists who are women, but also with lots of kissing who got to do fun romance things. But I did not realize that I'm sorry, there's some noise in my background here. Hopefully that's not coming through.
I don't
Uh,
hear
my husband's messing with the stereo system.
it.
Um, so when I first started writing fantasy romance, I didn't know that that's what I was writing. I had this great idea for a book, and I thought I'd been writing a lot of nonfiction. My first book was actually a collection of essays, and I'd started writing this narrative nonfiction novel that was not going well, and my editor had told me to put it in a drawer for a year. And I was like, well, what am I supposed to do now? And so I wrote this thing that I just wanted to write that was about a scientist that ends up in fairyland. And I tried to sell this book, and it was really, really hard to sell because nobody knew what genre it was. And when I ultimately sold it to a publisher, they called it fantasy romance. And I was like, huh, who knew there was such a thing?
How would you describe then what fantasy romance is? Of course, we started yesterday with Harriet Moore, who put together the whole Pharaoh Feb, and she had her definition of it. I didn't even know it existed either. I knew there was fantasy, which is my genre of choice, fantasy and sci-fi, which Anne McCaffrey, she's wonderful. Really, the only thing
Amazing.
I've read of hers is the Dragons of Pern series, but just fabulous from the prequels to the sequels and everything in between. And I know what romance is, but in my mind, the romance was the Debbie Macomber or Danielle Steele, or all I can picture are the books with Fabio on the cover riding a horse on a beach with a lady on the back of the horse. Didn't know that the two went together until I was put together with Harriet from another local writer here, and saw that some of the other books that I have read, Laurel K. Hamilton, being one, is I guess you would be considered fantasy romance.
She's probably more on the urban fantasy side, but
Okay,
yeah,
but
I mean,
yeah. So how do you define fantasy romance?
well, I should have listened yesterday and then I could have cheated and heard what Harriet had to say. It's somewhat in the eye of the beholder, but basically what it comes down to is that romance is a huge umbrella, that there is a recognizable plot arc for romance, which is, essentially boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. And you could swap out genders, you could swap out numbers there, but that's the romance expectation, that there's going to be a couple that comes together, or a poly, or what have you, that they encounter difficulties along the way, and then eventually they achieve their happy ever after. And that's the classic romance arc. Now, with fantasy, it's interesting because, and as you mentioned, I'm a member of Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, and I'm on the board, and we've had a lot of discussions about this, that science fiction and fantasy don't have standard plot arcs necessarily. Not like romance does, not like thriller does, not like mystery does. There's not really a fantasy plot arc. If I got you to identify a fantasy plot arc for me, like Dragon Riders of Pern, then we could find a counter almost immediately, right? George R. R. Martin writes fantasy, but his fantasy is not Naomi Novik's fantasy. We recognize them both as fantasy, but they don't have the same kind of plot driving them. And that's because science fiction and fantasy tend to be more about the setting. They're about where the story takes place. So you can have all kinds of different genres that take place within a science fiction or fantasy setting. You could have the hero's journey, you could have adventure story, you could have a mystery, thriller, all within a fantasy setting. And so basically what fantasy romance is it's a romance plot arc placed in a fantasy setting.
So when you decided that you wanted to become a writer, uh, you mentioned Anne McCaffrey. What are some of the other influences that led you to, be it either authors or movies or TV or something, art, that said, you know what? Yeah, that's the genre that I want to write about. Or was it just you were writing one day and that's just sort of what you found that you were writing
Well,
about?
I have always loved science fiction, fantasy, and romance both. So yes, definitely Anne McCaffrey, Mercedes Lackey is a
No.
huge influence. Vonda McIntyre, Mary Stewart, Jacqueline Carey. I've just been rereading Jacqueline Carey's original Kushiel's Legacy trilogy, and and I read it first like 20 years ago, and I've just been rereading it, and I'm recognizing how much I am influenced by by Jacqueline Carey. Also, Anne Rice.
Mm,
Uh, on the romance side, Nora Roberts
okay.
is a huge influence on me. Um, it's amazing, so many of these wonderful women writers who have done sort of this gamut of wonderful work in the genres.
Now, with all the books that you have written and all those influences on your writing, have you ever found that when you're writing, it sounded too familiar?
No.
And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not plagiarizing or anything like
Oh,
that, but
no, no, no.
just say, "Oh, where have I heard that? Oh, you know what? That was kind of like an Anne Rice thing." Or can you definitely feel, because I've read a lot of Anne Rice as well, and would I be able to pick that out in your books, or is yours just really different?
Well, I think one of the most wonderful moments is when somebody compares your books to one of your all-time favorite authors. So, like when one of my first sort of bigger publisher books came out, The Mark of the Tala, people compared it to Robin McKinley and Juliet Marillier. And I was like, just having a wonderful fangirl moment. I was like, really? Really? um, you know, and another one I want to mention is Tanith Lee. I should have mentioned her as
Yeah.
well, Robin McKinley. Um, I don't think that plagiarism or borrowing too heavily from other people is as much of a concern as people think that it is. Somebody once said to me, "We are rich because we steal from the best houses." And I really like that line from another author, but we're not really stealing. It's because it all goes into the big stew
Mhm.
pot, all the things that you read. So it's been fascinating to me, like I said, going back and revisiting Jacqueline Carey and realizing how much I was influenced by those books. But no, I never feel like something in one of my books is. I'll take one thing back, and I didn't realize I did this, but one of my best writing friends is Grace Draven, who also is participating in Faro Feb, and she's a wonderful fantasy romance author. And we were having a conversation about my Forgotten Empires books, and she said, just casually came out that my wizard in those books is named Ambrose, and that in one of her books, which I've read, she has a wizard named Ambrose. And I was like, what? No. And she said, oh yeah. She said, I thought it was funny that you did that too. And I'm like, I totally did not mean to steal that. And she's like,
Mhm.
oh, it doesn't matter. I don't care. But I wonder, did I subconsciously pull that in there or what?
Right. And that's what I'm at. Yeah, that's what I'm kind of
Yeah.
getting, alluding to is just subconsciously do some of those writers kind of work their way into your stories, but you don't realize it until either somebody mentions it or you're rereading it again, either through the editing phase or what have you, and or the writing phase, and say, oh no, wait a minute, that's way too much Anne Rice or Anne McCaffrey or um, Nora Roberts or whatever.
The only other way that I would say that sometimes comes out is like if I decide I really want to have a telepathic dragon, and I think, oh, is telepathic dragon too Anne McCaffrey, or is it enough of a generalized trope that dragons probably can't talk all that well, so maybe they're telepathic. That those are the kinds of conversations I have with myself
Right,
sometimes.
right. Well, we do have a Facebook watcher who commented, "Every romance has been written." And it's kind of like every bit of music has been written, but it's the writer's unique details that makes it new and fresh.
And your voice, that it's Ecclesiastes that there's nothing new under the sun, and that was you know thousands of
Yep.
years ago. So yeah, we don't worry about it too much.
Now you're from or you're in Santa Fe, New Mexico,
Yes.
and I can see the sun is shining there. Must be a nice warm day, and
Yeah, I had to put my shade down because otherwise I look a little too angelic.
it's dark and about 25 degrees, and we're expecting snow in a few hours.
Oh
So
dear.
it must be nice. But I had a great uncle who lived in Deming, New Mexico, and I visited a
Oh.
couple times. I moved to San Diego 20 some odd years ago, but I drove through New Mexico into Deming to say hi on my way. Is there a big fantasy romance um,
Um, I wouldn't say necessarily
in New
fantasy
Mexico?
romance, but there's a huge science fiction and fantasy community here. There's an almost uncanny concentration of science fiction and fantasy writers. And I've even been on a panel at my local convention where we talked about why are so many science fiction and fantasy writers drawn to the desert southwest of the US. And it's an interesting thing, but there's tons here. George R. R. Martin lives here in Santa Fe. Stephen R. Donaldson lives down in Albuquerque. Diana Gabaldon is over in Arizona across the border. And then tons and tons of other people that I would leave out some if I tried to list them all, but it's a vibrant and amazing community.
Do you think that might have to do with Roswell?
There every once in a while someone throws that out there and says it's because of Roswell. I think it's because of the landscape.
Yeah.
I think that it's a very open landscape. New Mexico, in particular, is very embracing of the arts. It's and we moved here on purpose, and it's interesting to live in a place because we wanted to live in Santa Fe, and it's interesting to live in a place where beauty is one of the primary values. Uh,
Well, when I drove across, I stopped in Albuquerque overnight, and thankfully I got there during the day, and so I was able to get out, walk around. There was a museum I think that I visited, but it was just absolutely gorgeous. And then even driving down in the south, down through Deming, there's not a lot out there, but what out there, of course, it was new to me too. So that was, um,
Yeah.
but it was beautiful country out there.
Yeah, it's incredible, and
Um,
we're always giving our thanks that we get to be here.
so how did you get involved with the Pharaoh Feb?
Harriet invited me, so I think she pinged me on Facebook or something like that and asked me if I would be interested in participating in an event. And I said, sure, because, there are not that many fantasy romance authors. We're a kind of a little subset. And so it's always cool to be able to do stuff to draw more attention to the
Mhm.
subgenre and talk to other authors and that kind of thing.
Well, some of the subgenres that you have are contemporary romance, fantasy. Like I said at the beginning, you have a ton of books, a lot of different series. And actually, I did want to mention at the beginning that your latest is The Golden Griffin and the Bear Prince. That one just came out a few days or well, a couple
Last
weeks ago
week,
or so. You have a new one coming out in a few days.
a
End
couple
of the
weeks.
month. Yeah, at the
Yeah,
end of
end
the
of the
month.
month.
The and actually it's a brand new series, and the first book's called Dark Wizard. I don't remember the name of the series, but we'll get into that. Um, Plus, you have a couple other books. Another one I think in May, and a couple other ones there. So, um, uh, each of your different series is kind of a different subgenre. So, like I was saying, contemporary romance, fantasy romance, futuristic romance, vampire romance, dystopian romance, paranormal romance. How do you keep them all straight?
It's actually not that difficult to keep straight. I don't think of them usually in terms of genre, with the exception of like the stuff that's contemporary versus the stuff that's fantasy. But I'm a very character driven writer, and so the different characters and the worlds that they inhabit are as different to me as like different members of my family. They're not easily mixed up in my head at all.
Do you ever get you're writing the next book in a certain series, and you say, "Well, wait a minute, that's that series over there," and have to.
I don't really. I think because they're different enough worlds. Sometimes if I write one book at a time, and so sometimes when I finish one book in one series and then I go over to another book in another series, I can see that I'm echoing certain themes. And I think, oh, well, this must be like my theme of this time, like my pandemic year theme. There were certain things that turned up, events and feelings that turned up in several different books in different series. And it's like clearly that was just the kind of thing that was on my mind and emerged in the story.
Now, some series that I've read, Terry Brooks is another famous, well, famous, but favorite of mine, and especially his Shannara series. But after a while, they got kind of old and repetitive, and you can kind of see his formula. Even with Laurel K. Hamilton, same thing. You can kind of see
Yeah.
the formula that she uses in the books. Kind of got a little smaller, a little thinner, not as in depth as the first few books in the series. We have a local writer who has multiple genres, from thrillers to horror to crime to espionage, and he's one book at a time person, and he goes from each one to make sure he keeps, especially some of his series, fresh. Is that what you do, just kind of one book at a time, move on to a different series, or do you do a couple in a row, then move on to a different series?
Almost always I end up doing interlacing series, going from one book and then going to a different series. But that's more because of me balancing the schedule, because I have my traditional publishers I work with my contracted deadlines, but then I also self-publish books. So I'm always balancing the work between the various ones. And usually that means to keep sort of the pipeline going, it means going from between different series. And then it's also kind of a palate cleanser that way,
Right.
so that I exactly don't get tired of of the series or the world.
One of our another Facebook uh, watcher, Carrie Moser. She's another one of our authors that we have here. Fantastic contemporary fiction writer. She's asking, do you feel you maintain your voice, quote unquote, voice, as you switch genres from fantasy romance to poetry and other genres?
Um, yes and no. I would say that the different genres definitely have different voices to them. And the poetry is actually a bit of a red herring that kind of happened by accident because I was an essayist at the time and I had an essay that I couldn't get to work. And a poet friend of mine suggested that I phrase it as a series of poems instead. And and then those ended up winning that fellowship that year. But I haven't written all that much poetry, so that was just kind of a fluky thing. But it's interesting. I have written a whole lot in contemporary romance. My erotic romances were the things that I sold first, partly because I think they were more uh, down the middle of a genre as opposed to being weirdly cross genre. At, but my fantasy romances are the books that have hugely done much better for me. And it's something I've thought about a lot, that sometimes I wonder if uh, different authors have a particular genre where their voice just really shines, where people really grok that particular thing. And there's lots of stories, it seems like, of authors who have been, like struggling or midless, and then they move in and do something different, and then all of a sudden they break out. And I sometimes I wonder if that's why, if that's what's going on.
Again, you have a lot of books. How many books a year do you usually put out?
Um, it's usually around six. And I do some smaller stuff too, some novellas.
Mhm.
So it depends on length. But yeah, it's worked out to being in the neighborhood of six for the last few years.
Well, speaking of novellas and speaking of what you just mentioned, erotic romance, you one thing I learned from the Pharaoh Feb website was there's different heat levels, quote
Mm.
unquote, heat levels to fantasy romance. You have BDSM novellas, erotic contemporary serial novellas, erotic romance trilogies. What are the different heat levels that you got going on there compared to your other um, non-heat?
I don't
Or what's the
have
heat
much
level in all of
that's
them?
non-heat, actually.
Okay.
I pretty much always have high heat in my books. The Yeah, like the contemporary BDSMs would be the ones that are probably the far end because they're very deliberately playing with kinky things. But I don't really have any books where there is no sex at all. It's always to me that's very much a natural part of life and a part of character and people interacting with each other, so that I don't think I'm capable of doing like the closed door thing.
Now, trying to figure out how to phrase this without getting too personal. The
You could be
BDSM,
personal.
okay, the BDSM part. Did you have to do any research for, because, and I don't mean personal, but just internet research or whatever for to make it realistic. Really, that's the whole idea, right? Is to make it realistic so that the reader can get into the characters and at least emotionally
Well,
feel.
yeah, so there's a yes and no there. I mean, I also like to read it. So by reading, that's great. It's fun research. Um, but in some ways, you don't want to be too realistic. That's a hole that you can go down that I don't, it can be detrimental to the story because we're still talking about escapism. We're still talking about the fantasy of it. And, like the people who do the serious BDSM lifestyle will get very much into the rules and, observing consent, which is what you have to do in real life, right?
Mhm.
There's this whole set of stuff for real life and how things have to be handled. And in an erotic novel, you don't have to worry so much about chafing, for example, or, because you're creating that escapist fantasy. So I've known, I knew one couple in particular that were in a DS relationship, and they came to conferences for a while, and they were writing books about it, and they were very upset that people were not more interested in their books, and they're like, but we've got everything exactly right, it's exactly real. And I was like, yeah, people don't necessarily want an instruction manual, they want the ride, they want the emotions.
And maybe leave a little bit to the imagination instead of having it all out there.
Yeah, yeah, there is that too.
Lisa over on Facebook is asking, what is the length of your usual book? She's a writer as well, and she writes about 80,000 word book that took a year and a half to write, edit, and self-publish. How long is your process from beginning to publishing?
So my novellas are usually in the 26,000 word range. My short novels, I've done some short novels that were more about 60,000 words. Uh, Typically, my novels are in the range of 90,000. My longest was like 120,000. I usually shoot for 90 to 100. My publisher, St. Martin's, doesn't like me to go past 120,000, so I've had to cut back a couple of times. But my process, I'm a pretty fast writer. Uh, I'm also a full time writer. So I write about 3,000 words a day, 5 days a week. So that means that generally I can draft a book in the neighborhood of 55 days. And
Well,
then I will spend a couple of weeks revising that, but I write pretty clean. So I know that this is faster than a lot of people, but I think it's really important that we each own our processes. It takes as long as it takes. So for me to, from when I start a book and get it all the way through, like my proofreader and published, I can do that generally in the neighborhood of 3 months.
wow, wow. Do you have any rituals? Being a full-time writer, do you have any certain rituals that you like to do before you start writing, after you start writing, while you're writing? If you get stuck, for example, um, a local writer we have here, he gets stuck, he goes and he cranks up some heavy metal music, and just kind of just lets that sort of cleanse his head until he'll get an idea and then sit back down and get unstuck. We have some that begin with a cup of tea, and some other music, a gong for more of a spiritual type getting going. Is there anything that you'd like to do in particular that to get going?
Um, I am a big believer in habit, in building a writing habit. I write in the mornings because that's when I'm freshest. I have a walking desk, and that's really huge for me. So I walk on the treadmill as I write. I have a hydraulic desk that goes up and down, and I start at pretty much the same time every day. So my mornings are pretty, I would say pretty ritualized just overall. I try not to look at the internet at all before I write. So, and certainly try to keep my brain clear for like the first couple of hours after I wake up. So it's reading, I exercise, feed the cats and do all of that kinds of thing. And I record a podcast 4 days a week over my first cup of coffee. So I chat over the podcast, that kind of thing. And then I work at my walking desk and I write for an hour, and then I take about a 20-minute break and then write for another hour, and 20-minute break and another hour. And generally I can get my 3,000 words in those 3 hours, maybe a little bit more. Um, I write for discovery, or a pantser, as many people call it. I prefer the term gardener. So I don't really get stuck in the same way that is difficult for some people. uh, I keep writing through it when I feel like I've hit a sticky spot. So, but a lot of writers talk about taking walks, and there's been a lot of interesting data on walking and how that frees up thinking. And I think walking on the treadmill really helps with that kind of trance induction and just lets me uh, open up.
How long have you been writing? Full-time
Um,
writing.
Full time writing. Oh, just full time since fall of 2015.
So over those 5 or 6 years or so, your brain's probably just into that routine now. So that's when you're the freshest. You have that routine, so your brain's already wired to get the
Yes,
work
yeah.
done.
Yeah, and before that, I had a day job with an environmental consulting firm for 18 years, and I worked from home for a whole lot of that. And I had a lot of very definite rituals for dividing which work I was doing. I would write before work, and then I would switch over. In one house, I had a totally different desk for my day job, and I had a lot of things that I would do to cue myself to be in those different headspaces.
So from that transition from your environmental job to becoming a full-time writer, has any of that past life worked its way into any of your novels, or just everyday life, walking down the street or at the grocery store and say, I like the look of that person. I'm going to write a character like her into or him into the next novel, or something somebody said.
I'm always interested in people's situations and their lives. Like, so I have borrowed that people who have been, like struggling with a bad relationship or with difficult families. So it's more like the emotional situations will work their way into my books. But definitely environment and landscape are important to me. Um, the I'm trained as a biologist, so I do bring in a whole lot of the environment and ecosystems into my book. So I'm always thinking about like what is the larger ecosystem around them, and how is that interacting with the society and so forth. So I think a lot of the biology leaks in like that, but I do collect pictures of landscapes, and a lot of the different landscapes come into my books very deliberately.
And so I know you have a publishers and you have an agent. Um, do you ever, you've done your own personal editing of your manuscript, do you have any friends, family that you use as beta readers? And
I Oh, go
oh, go
ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead.
Yes, I have different groups, and I've done different things at different times. I've been part of a couple of different critique groups and had critique partners. These days, I use mainly beta readers. I do have developmental editors if I feel like I need it for a particular book. At this point, I've written enough books that I don't necessarily hire a developmental editor for my self-published stuff. But I really enjoy my editor at St. Martin's on the Forgotten Empires book. She's an amazing editor and really fun to work with. I appreciate her input to the books. Uh, but yeah, there's a group here that's called the New Mexico Beto Readers, which is, not very inventive, but we trade work. And then I have just other author friends that I hit up from time to time, sometimes for the whole thing, but usually more often it'll be for a specific scene or problem, or we'll bounce ideas off of each other.
Have any of them said, okay, that's me? As they're reading, they're doing their beta reading,
Oh,
and a character saying, that's me. Why did you write, or how did you write me into story? Has that ever happened? Have you ever used people, places? I know you use ecosystem, ecology and stuff, for scenery and stuff, but people, um, family, friends that would they could
no,
recognize.
I don't think I've ever used anybody that specifically. I don't know that even the people that I was thinking of, like a particular situation, I think if they read the book, I don't think they would recognize themselves, because the character always ends up being a different person. They always end up being wholly themselves.
Now, do you visualize your characters? Do you have, besides just either just a basic description, they're going to be tall, they're going to be short, they're going to have blonde hair, dark hair, or do you actually have whole? face?
Um, It depends. It depends on the character. There are times when I've had a very specific physical type. Like there was one heroine, I did base her physical appearance entirely off of a gal that I worked with because I thought she was so adorable. It was like, I want this
Mhm.
exact kind of physicality. Most of the
Well,
time,
and I don't mean to interrupt, but that's kind of what I was asking before. So if she was to read the book and read the description of this character, would she recognize herself?
no, because the person was entirely different.
Okay.
So I don't think she would have recognized her physicality. Yeah. So, I lost track, I guess.
I'm sorry. No,
That's
well,
all
it was
right.
just do you visualize
Oh, yeah,
your
the visualizing.
characters?
Sometimes, but I'm usually inside the characters' heads, so I don't always know what they look like at first, and I have to figure it out later. But, a common interview question is people ask you to dream cast the book, and pick out like which actors would play your characters. And I know some authors are really good at that and they already know and they have their Pinterest boards and that kind of thing. And I usually have to throw it out on social media and say, okay, you guys, who do you think would play this character? And my readers know, fortunately. And then I just say, oh, okay, I'll go look at the pictures and be like, okay, yeah, that's about right.
Well, as we continue, you've got about 30 minutes before I actually do ask that question to think about who would play.
Oh, oh.
That's one of those fun questions I like to ask towards the end. But so let's go back to your series here. So you got a few new books coming out for some of your series. You've got the Sorceress Moon series, the Chronicles of Dasnaria. How did you come up with that name?
I don't know. It just came to me. That was one of the ones that, as I was writing, it was just Desnaria.
Misconnections, the Uncharted Realms, Between 12 Kingdoms and Uncharted Realms, Falling Under, Covenant of Thorns, and the list just keeps going. Blood Currency, that's a standalone book.
It's
Petals.
actually a pairing of two shorts that I did for Alora's Cave back in the day.
One thing I did notice, if anybody goes to your website, jeffekennedy.com, uh, all your books are listed. They're all separated by their not only their genre or subgenre, but also their series. But you also have, which I thought was neat when I was looking at it, the order that they go in, including some of the offshoots that are like book 2.5 or book 4.5, and then it goes back into book 4 and 5 and so on. So if anybody looks at your initial uh, web page and sees all these books, you've got it broken down into their different categories and stuff. Is
Yeah,
that
yeah.
something somebody suggested, or is that something that you wanted to do to make sure that everybody had everything in the right order, being so many books?
It's been a combination of the two that over time, uh, yeah, people ask questions and also I just like online being part of like the reading blogging community, that one thing every reader wants is the reading order. It's like what order, because most of us are, I want to start with book one and don't tell me different. um, and then sometimes I see them on other websites. Like I added one to my website that's a where should I start with your books? Little quiz kind of thing. And I totally stole that from Kelly Armstrong because she had that on her site. And so I was like, can I steal that? Because that's a really good idea.
So what if somebody wants to start reading your books, what is the best series to start with?
Well, the way I ask people is depends on what you like to read, right? Do you prefer contemporary? Do you prefer fantasy? Do you prefer a completed series? Do you like first person or third person POV? Because I do write in both. So, places for people to start are, well, Orchid Throne is the first book in Forgotten Empires, and that's the one that I've been doing with St. Martin's. It's a good place to start because it's its own world. This trilogy is a same hero heroine, and in a totally unconnected world to anything else. So some people like that. The third book is the one that's coming out in May, And then if you really want to get into one of my biggest series, this is the book I was mentioning earlier, The Mark of the Tala. That's the beginning of the 12 Kingdoms trilogy, which then continues on into the Uncharted Realms. And there's a bunch of books in that series. So sometimes that's intimidating to people. We'll try to put that back. Um, but it depends on, some people are like, oh yes, sign me up for the 8-book series, and other people are like, oh, I don't really want to commit to that.
Have you done or have you thought of doing a crossover for any of your series?
A crossover.
Such as so the next book in, we'll just pick a series, the Uncharted Realms. So the next book, when you start writing that, do a crossover into the Chronicles of Dasnaria, so that
Oh,
there's elements of two. So on your chart of order of reading, you have them both on both timelines because they cross over into both.
so actually that happened. And it happened with Chronicles of Dasnaria because that trilogy I wrote later, and it goes back about 20 years before The Mark of the Tala. And then and it fills in some history, like you hear a story about this lost princess, and that trilogy is about her and what happened with her. And then at the end of the Uncharted Realms, I wound this up last year, so it ends up with the fate of the Tala. So it came around full circle. And in this book, the princess in Chronicles of Dasnaria turns up, and then there's like one more novella after that, which is The Lost Princess Returns, and it comes after this book. So they sort of synced up at that point.
Okay. So which ones, how many of your series are complete and which ones are you still working
Uh,
on
well,
or would
12
like to work on?
Kingdoms and Uncharted Realms are complete. Sorceress Moons is complete. Forgotten Empires will be complete in when the book comes out in May. So I mean, I'm done working. I'm done writing that. Um, and then some of my, like all of my contemporary romances, except for the Misconnection series, I intended that to be a 5-book series, and I've still only written 3. But otherwise, I think everything else is complete. I started these 2 new series this year. You mentioned the Golden Griffin and the Bear Prince, which came out a couple of weeks ago, which is kind of season 2 of this series. That's the next generation. It's the kids. So it jumps forward 25 years. I should probably say that's on 99 cents through this weekend. So that is a place to start if I deliberately created that if people didn't want to go back to the beginning of 12 Kingdoms and Uncharted Realms, that it could start there. And then Dark Wizard is start of a new series too.
How do you decide when you're done with a series? Is it just sort of naturally come, or you've got one series that looks like it has 9 books in it? The Sorceress Moons looks like it has like
Sorcerer's Moons
9.
is 6 books.
Okay, 6 books. So, but after 6 books, does it just naturally run its course, or do you say, okay, you know what, I'm really done. Let's wrap this one up so I can move on to a brand new series.
It's some of both. I mean, I'm been a reader much longer than I've been a writer, so I totally sympathize with same experiences you mentioned, like Laurel K. Hamilton, uh, where I love those books, but then after a while, it just, that a series can go on too long. And I know
Mhm.
a lot of people still love those series and those books, but I don't want to. I don't want to do that. I don't want to keep writing something after it no longer has the buzz for me. So most of my series, there is an overall series arc, and when I get to that finale, when I get to that big final conflict, I try to end it there. And then if I'm going to do more in that world, I try to make it very defined, like, going on and doing the heirs of magic, like Golden Griffin, like next generation, totally new arc.
So, like with the Dark Wizard, did you start with like an outline and say, okay, this is how it's going to begin, this is how it's going to be end, and we'll see how many books it takes to get to that ending?
No, because I don't outline.
You do an outline.
Um, because I'm a write for discovery author, so I'm incapable of pre-plotting. I don't know how my books are going to end. Oh, sometimes it would be nice if I did, but I just can't. I don't have that muscle. So the Uncharted Realms ended up being a longer series because it took me much longer to get to the ending than I thought it should. Or I thought that it would when I started. There just kept being more things happening. Um, but if with yeah, so like with Dark Wizard, I know it's going to be a trilogy with the same hero and heroine in that trilogy, which I knew with Forgotten Empires, and I know that they're going to have to eventually solve the big conflict, but I don't know exactly how they'll get there and what they'll do.
So if you want to keep it within the trilogy, and you had mentioned a while ago that your publisher doesn't like you to go over 120,000 words, but each book ends up being 150, 180,000 words. But if you take those out, it'll make a fourth book. You could easily stretch it out to a fourth book. Would you be willing to change it from the trilogy to a fourth book, or would you scale it back to fit into just that, keep it as that trilogy?
I I don't think I would do that. I don't go over by that much. I'm for all that I do write for Discovery and that I don't have an outline, I do follow a pretty close structure. I follow the 8 scene, 3 act structure, and I pretty much always know where I am in the book. So there's been a few times when I've gone over to like 125,000 words, but in that case, I'm usually able to go back to the beginning and just streamline and tighten it up so that I don't have to. The only times that it's ended up being a longer series, like the 12 Kingdoms and Uncharted Realms books, are a different heroine sort of taking up the quest and doing her piece. And it ended up being more books in that case because there just ended up being more pieces of the puzzle to put together.
So that structure that you just mentioned, 3x something,
Eight
what is
scene,
that?
3 act.
Okay.
So it basically comes from screenwriting, and there's some good people that teach it. But 3 act structure is very standard Western storytelling structure. It's the one that we tend to have an unconscious expectation of. So the first act is the first 25% of the book. And I try to have all stakes set by the end of the first 25%. Act two is the middle 50% of the book. So the midpoint occurs halfway through at the midpoint of the book, halfway through Act two. You have your Act two climax. And then Act three is kind of the last 25%, last 15 to 20%, because then you have a little bit after that's the wrap up and denouement. And then in each of those, so you end up with 4 chunks. Act one, first part of Act two, second part of Act two, and then Act three. And within each of those 4 chunks, they're divided into two scenes. So you have 8 scenes overall.
Hmm. Now, do you write all this out by hand? Do you use, I guess a Scrivener is a program that it's like a
I
note-taking
I
thing,
don't
or
use Scrivener. No, I use Word. I write from beginning to end, and I just write in Word on the keyboard.
Mhm. Do you ever, when you're out somewhere, do you ever say, "Hey, I need a napkin. Give me a napkin to write down a thing," or do you carry a little digital voice recorder around when you have an idea?
Well, the memo app on my phone is an amazing thing.
There you go.
So
There you go.
occasionally I will put things into my phone, but I don't worry about it overly much because one of the things that I found, I used to write stuff down all the time and be panicking that I would lose an idea. And one of the things that I've discovered is I don't think we really do lose those ideas. I think they stay in our heads and they pop up again when we need them. I've talked about with the writer friends. I'm sure this has happened to people out there. There's been countless times when I've like been going back and revising, and I think, okay, so I really need to put this idea in this paragraph, and I'll look, and like one line down, there it is. It, like sometimes even verbatim what I was about to put in. So, I think that the ideas live with us. They're not as um, fragile as we sometimes think they are.
Now, do you do any screenwriting, or have you taken
No.
classes in screenwriting, or is this just something that you picked up from other friends or writing other writers?
Well, when I first started writing a novel, I switched from writing short. I'd been writing essays, poetry, short fiction, and started writing this novel and realized that writing a novel is an incredibly different animal and that I did not know what I was doing. And so I cast about looking for ways to structure things because the most common advice, and it actually kind of drives me crazy, is that when newbies are looking for ways to learn to write a novel, is people will always tell you the outline. That that is the standard advice, and there's all kinds of classes that are like plotting for pantsers, to teach people like me how to pre-plot, because we do plot. Uh, and the thing is I don't think that you have to do it that way. I'm always wanting to know where are the classes that are pantsing for plotters. Like, forget your outline. Stop spending so much time on your outline and just write the book. Um, I think that so when I was looking for ways to structure the book, basically what that percentage structure does is it helps me frame where I am as I'm writing. And if I'm revising, I know where I need to tighten. So like if I'm at 40% of my projected word count and I still haven't set all the stakes for the book, I know that I've got a problem. So it's a cue that way. But yes, I did go out and I found various people who taught that. Alexandra Sokolov teaches that. She's great, and she has a lot of free stuff on her website. So that was just very helpful for me to learn to take what I intuitively knew about story and put it into a framework that would allow me to understand the shape of what I was doing.
So more of your writing, personal writing, it comes more natural through just um, your own knowledge, what you like to read. You don't have a degree in writing. It just sort of came through.
No, I have a graduate degree in science before I figured out that I didn't want to be a research scientist and that I wanted to be a writer. And but at least it gave me a good day job for many years. Once I figured out that I didn't want to be a scientist, I did start taking classes at the university in the town that I lived in Wyoming. They had a visiting writers series, and I would take the night classes with the visiting writers. And so I learned lots of different kinds of genres and a great deal about writing from them. But no, I don't have I don't have an MFA. I don't never went to Clarion West or any of those things.
Did you do or still do, well, when we can do again, conventions, writers groups, writer retreats? We have a lot, some of our authors who every year would go up to northern Maine to a writer's retreat for a week or a month and just write.
How
Obviously,
fun.
things are a little different because they're doing it more Zoom now, but so they're still involved. But have you ever done anything like that, a writer's retreat or?
Well, when I did one of the things that you mentioned when you were doing my bio was the UCross Foundation. That was a really wonderful writer's residency in northern Wyoming that I got to go and stay there for 2 weeks, and they fed me and I did nothing but write, and they treated me like I was curing cancer, and that was incredible to do. You have to apply, like pass the jury trial and all that kinds of thing. But those writers' residencies are amazing if you can do those, because it's very good for teaching you to value what you're doing.
So
But
oh, go ahead, finish.
but as far as like writing retreats and so forth, I love going to conferences. I go to Southwest Nebula conference and the RWA conference, and more and more, some of my friends and I have been talking about that when we can, that we would like to do something like that, like I'll just fly into some place and spend a weekend together or something like that.
Do you think your training in being a scientist, obviously you must have had to write research papers and theses and things like that. Do you think that may have helped with your writing style, your writing in general?
Sure. And I do have to think back and give credit to my AP English teacher in my senior year in high school. Denise Sobiek really whipped me into shape as a writer. But then, yes, I absolutely learned how to write technically. And in college, I was also a religious studies major. I comparative religious studies, and so I wrote a lot of those papers. So yes, I had a lot of writing experience, and I do think being a scientist has helped me be. I'm a pretty concise writer, a pretty tight writer. I think that's why I write pretty clean because I did have that kind of training.
Have you ever thought about going back to some of your novellas and short stories and turning them into a new series or just a standalone?
Well, most of the ones that I've been writing lately are parts of those worlds already. But there's one story in particular from early on called Pearl that was one of my first fiction publications. And I used to have it up self-published, but I took it down because it doesn't have a happy ending. And I finally decided that my readers were going to be annoyed with me that it didn't have a happy ending. And I would love to revisit that story. I've thought it's a science fiction story, and I've thought about expanding that.
So last night, when we were talking with Harriet, we were trying to figure out the difference between fantasy romance, romance fantasy, and the question was brought up about having a happy ending or a happily for now, happy for now. Um, do you think that's a distinction between romance fantasy and fantasy romance? Does there really have to be a happy ending um,
I
in
think if
fantasy
you're gonna,
romance? And
I,
does your writing always have to end with a happy ending?
yes, because my readers expect it. I feel very strongly if you're going to call a book romance, then if you want the romance readers, that is the one rule to rule them all. You, you must give a happy ending, and it can't be the happy for now, but there's always someone who thinks that they shouldn't have to follow that rule, and that's fine. Then don't call it a romance
Okay.
because that's the definition of romance.
Um, all right. So
So I've
let's.
got a question on this chat. Shall I?
Well,
On the
that's what we're kind of. I was getting to
Okay.
next because I keep staring at that nice Oscar-looking statue behind into your right
Oh,
there on the shelf. Is that one of your awards?
it is. So this is what they're asking about. This is my RITA Award, and it is made by the same company that makes the Oscars.
Ah,
So it's very heavy,
it
and
looks it.
yeah. So I won this for The Pages of the Mind, which was the first book in the Uncharted Realms uh, after the 12 Kingdoms trilogy, the Pages of the Mind. And so to answer the question that, and I'll read it for the people out there. Uh, I don't know if you say Vila or Vela, but she asks, in the RITA Awards, there wasn't a separate fantasy romance category, was there? When I won mine for Pages of the Mind, were you in paranormal romance competing against vampire and shifter romances, etc.? And yes, that's exactly right. And at the bottom, it'll be backwards, so I won't show you guys, but it does say 2017 paranormal romance. And yes, RWA has a single category for paranormal romance that includes science fiction romance, urban fantasy that fits romance definitions. The year before me, a gal won for a time travel romance that was like pretty much historical, except that it had that time travel element to it, vampire, shifter, everything. So, yeah, all of that goes into one big pot of being called paranormal romance for RWA.
What are some of the other awards? I had mentioned some of the other awards. How was that? Pretty exciting to get those awards too and
Yeah, yeah.
nominations.
Yeah, this these don't show up very well, but they're from RT, which actually no longer exists. But when the Mark of the Tala came out, uh, this was 2014. I got this award, which is the Seal of Excellence, and that was the book that they picked out from all the books reviewed that month in any genre as the outstanding book. And they gave it to books that pushed genre conventions. So for me, that was a huge thing because I had spent so long being told that my books didn't fit into any genre. I actually had this one agent when I was pitching to her. One of the few times that I cried, she actually made me cry, and she told me that my books fell in the cracks between genres. And so I sat in the bar afterwards and cried, and my friends decided to call me a crack hoe because my books fell in the cracks between genres. So, yeah, getting that recognition for writing something that was pushing genre conventions was hugely validating. And same with, getting the RITA was just an amazing experience.
Well, congratulations to all that. It's are you up for any other awards for this coming year, or for some of the newer ones that you
Um, I entered the Fiery Crown in RWA's new incarnation. They retired the Rita because there were so many problems with racism and so forth, and it's been recreated as the Vivian. So I've entered that book. I don't know. I haven't found we haven't found out about any of the finalists yet. Uh, so no, I don't think anything is up for any particular awards that I know of.
so like for the Rita Award, is it something that you submit to, or is that something that um, your publisher submits for you, or just somebody publisher saw it, picked it up, and said, "Oh, I like this. Let's submit this for."
Well, all the awards are run differently, but RWA's is one where you submit your own book and you have and I really like RWA's model. Some people don't because you pay a submission fee, and there are some, like SEFWA is very much anti paying a submission fee. But when you enter your book in the Ritas or the Vivian, then you have a panel of five judges that it goes out to five people, and they all read the book and they score it, and then the books with the high enough score become finalists, and then another group of five people read and score to decide the winners. So with other awards, like Seth Nebula Award, people nominate books, and there's a reading list where they could say, I think this is a book worth reading, but it tends to be the books that everybody's talking about will rise to the top there. You don't have any way of guaranteeing that a certain number of people will read your book and make a decision about it.
So do those judges have a certain I would assume they would have a certain criteria that they have to go by, but then it's also there must be some subjectivity to their decision.
Well, it's always subjective, right? Everything is, yeah.
And have you ever said, you know what, that book really wasn't that good. Mine was a lot better.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, that always happens. And it's funny with, like the scoring, RWA's done different things in different years. Sometimes there's a very detailed score sheet, and sometimes it's just a ranking of 1 to 10, and you could do points in between. But I have had some books that have gotten 9.8 from one judge and a 4 from another. And so you're always like, well, what was that about?
Yeah, my daughter in school, in high school, did or actually for quite a while did competitive cheerleading, and so they do have that criteria they have to go through for the technical stuff, but then there's always that subjectivity of the style and the music and the dance and things like that. So yeah. Um, so what is your favorite? What was your favorite series to write? Do
I
you have a
love
favorite
writing them
series?
all. I really do love. I do love writing them all. That's and in some ways it's unfair because it's like the thing that you've written most recently is the one that you love the best. I'm super excited about Dark Wizard because it was an idea I'd had for a while, And it was one of those books that just really grabbed me by the throat and demanded to be written. So that doesn't always happen. But, so maybe I would pick that one.
Do you do you have others on the back burner or little notes about other series that you'd like to start?
Yes, I do. But I try to be pretty good about, I mean, that's this is how I support my husband and me is
Mhm.
from the writing. And so I do have to be aware of market stuff and having, keeping the installments coming in the series is important as opposed to, writing whatever is shiniest at the time. If I think you learn pretty early on as a novelist that you can't just run off and chase the shiny because then you'll never finish a book.
So let's talk about the marketing. So um, you have a few self-published, but you're primarily, correct me if I'm wrong, primarily through a publisher. You had mentioned St. Martin's Press. You also have an agent. What was the deciding factor from going from self-publishing to getting a publisher and going that next step of getting an agent? How did you go about getting an agent?
So I actually did it in the reverse order.
Okay.
I got an agent. Well, okay, so here's the way it worked. I had that first book that became the Covenant of Thorns trilogy, and I could not sell that. I uh, queried many agents. Nobody wanted to represent me. I spent like 3 years trying to sell that first book, and everybody kept saying, "Oh, it's a great story, and you're a wonderful writer. We have no idea how to sell this book." And ultimately, I sold it to Carina Press, which was Harlequin's brand new at the time digital imprint. And because they were doing ebook only, they were able to take chances on weird cross genre stuff. And when after that book was published, an agent read that book and she contacted me and asked me if I was represented. And so I'm on my third agent now. That's a kind of a long story, but she was my first agent, and she's the one who sold the 12 Kingdoms trilogy to Kensington for me.
So for
So
for
go ahead.
those who for those who are thinking about, because again, one of the things we're trying to do with this is for those who come to us asking these questions. How do I do this? How do I get started? How did you? What are some of the pitfalls and pluses of having an agent?
Well, it's very true as far as pitfalls that having a bad agent is worse than having no agent at all. And my first agent ended up leaving, and I stayed with the agency and went with a newer agent at that agency. And I felt like he really stalled out my career badly for a couple of years. There were a lot of things that were not right there. And I moved to my current agent, who's amazing and does everything that I need. The great thing about her, she helps me strategize next steps in my career. She sells sub rights for me. She, negotiates with the publisher. Uh, it's really good to have someone who's on excuse me, on your team who's really fighting for you. So, and if you want to sell to the bigger publishers in trad publishing, you you almost definitely need an agent. You don't have to do it that way,
Mhm.
but there are a lot of editors that will not look at stuff unless it's agented.
Do they help with the marketing aspect, or is that more of the publisher side of
It's
it?
more on the other end of things where the publisher will handle a lot of the publicity. A lot of it's incumbent on the authors.
Mhm.
But like I will go through with Agent Sarah and talk about ideas and say, here's something that you're asking about ideas for a new series. I'll send her a list of ideas and she'll say, well, I don't think the time's right for this one. Let's try this one. Why don't you write up a little bit more on this one and let's talk about that because she knows what editors are buying at any given time. And then to fill in the rest of the question that you'd asked before with the self-publishing, I ended up doing more of that later. Self-publishing is great because you get money coming in every month. whereas trad publishing pays you twice a year. So unless you're getting paid a whole lot of money from trad, which not that many authors are, it's good to add in self-publishing. And with Kensington, like they did those first 5 books, and then they didn't want to keep going with the series, so I kept going with it on my own and finished out the series.
And we've had some mention from some of our authors that we have that who were with small presses traditionally published and went self-publishing because, especially because of COVID, a lot of the publishers have gotten backed up in their publishing of books. Have you run into that problem?
No, but the only trad contract I have right now is with St. Martin's, and my editor is really Johnny on the spot as far as schedules and everything, and we had no delays at all with the only bad thing was that the Fiery Crown came out May 26th last year, so I'd had all these wonderful bookstore events and launches and so forth, and didn't get to do any of them.
Mhm.
But as far as the publishing schedule, no, that hasn't been a problem.
That doing bookstore events, in-person events, I'm willing to bet that you're looking forward to the day that you can start doing them again.
Absolutely. So looking forward to. I really do. I hadn't realized how much of my social life was formed around conferences and other writer reader events.
How have you had to tailor that due to COVID? More online stuff, more social media?
Yeah, doing all of these Zoom interviews like this. That's kind of why I have the big poster of the Fiery Crown behind me. I ended up doing like all of those launch events and interviews like this.
So Fabro Feb must have been a great thing to come along to help with that. Harriet, who's watching, she says we did a poll on where Pharaoh Feb followers told us that they feel like fantasy romance books were hard to find. I'm assuming it's much better now than when you first started. But do you feel like this is still a struggle for the genre?
I do. I feel like it's becoming more of a recognized genre. There's a funny thing that happens with fantasy romance is that it gets conflated with YA fantasy. And even for uh, women authors of fantasy get thrown into YA fantasy, uh, even though even though we write very adult stuff. But I will see on Goodreads that like my stuff gets shelved in YA fantasy, and I've had people be very upset after reading my books and saying this book was not YA at all. I'm like, no, it sure wasn't. And it's been an interesting thing, that conflation, and I think that's made things difficult. But I do think that, yeah, it's been this sort of little weird cross genre, and the the arbiters on either side of it tend to make things more difficult because there are the people who love fantasy, love epic fantasy, and regard any kind of romance as like getting kissing cooties in there. And you can probably imagine some of these, people online who get really upset if there's kissing in their fantasy books. And then there are a lot of romance readers who do not like dense world building. And they'll say, I've even read reviews of some books where they'll say, oh, well, I really liked this one because it didn't have all of that difficult world building in it. And so it's like, well, everybody has to kind of find their flavor. But yeah, I think that fantasy romance has still been kind of finding its following. And I don't know what the solution. I think, yeah, the Faro Feb event is great because, and I tried to do some of these things before, and I was not nearly as organized as Harriet. Harriet knows what she's doing, so I'm very happy to coattail on Harriet's organization, because I do think that's what we have to do, is just sort of build this resource and say, okay, look, here is the spectrum of fantasy romance books. Here are all these great things. It's not the same as YA fantasy. There's overlap, but if you're looking for it, here's where you can find it.
So, what YA authors have you been compared to?
Well, there's a lot of, I mean, Sarah J. Maas is such a zeitgeist. And so people will they want more stuff like Sarah J. Maas. And she's kind of a funny outlier too, because her Throne of Glass series is much more YA than the Akotar series. And then she has the new one, which is even more adult. Let's see, what other well, like there's ones like Holly Black is more YA. Um, I'm trying to think.
Yes.
I know I'm not going to be able to think of any of these people, but
Like, and this always comes up. Stephanie Meyer's, like Twilight.
Stephanie Meyer, yeah, and in many ways, and I loved Twilight. I'm not one of these people who, disses Twilight, because I read those books and I thought they were phenomenal. I thought she did an amazing job on those. And one of the huge impacts of Twilight, I think, is that it did enable the blossoming of a fantasy romance, because so many of my readers, Twilight was their gateway drug, and they read that and then they were like, wait, I can have this cool paranormal stuff and kissing. And so, and they looked for more and more of that.
Yeah,
I think it created a huge generation of fantasy romance readers.
I did. Yeah, I did read the first couple, but I'm a traditionalist, and I said this last night. I'm a traditionalist when it comes to vampires. They can't sparkle and be out in the sun. So,
But vampires
but
aren't real, so you
right,
actually you can change up details. There's no hard and
right,
fast rule there.
right. So, what are some of the other things that you do, or did, or do now, as far as marketing, or like you said, because a lot of it has to come down to the authors, and that's one thing I try to stress with the authors that I speak to here, is you have to market your book. I'll do what I can especially when I first get it in, but I have thousands of titles that I have to, and other products to market, and it's your book. How important is it for the author to get out there, and what are some of the other things that you do?
It's very important, and it's a downside of things because most authors are introverts, and we wouldn't be happy being by ourselves for so much of the time. Uh, but social media is a great way to market books, because you can decide how much you share online, and it's easy to walk away from if you feel overwhelmed. You can choose your level of interaction. I do think, a lot of authors don't like Goodreads, but I think being on sites like Goodreads and BookBub are really good, because if you review other books, and for me, this is a personal choice, but I only review books that I liked, and so it's my chance to talk up a book. And then that gets conversations going. You have conversations with readers on Facebook and Twitter too. And and on Instagram now, there's the whole Bookstagram thing, which is great because people take beautiful pictures of your covers in great settings. And now my new thing is I'm probably gonna have to learn TikTok, because I guess like there's this whole book talk thing that people are sharing stuff on. It's like, oh, another thing to learn. But I do think that interaction is helpful. And but indie bookstores like yours, where people are hand selling your books, that's a great thing. I love going to bookstores and meeting the people who you know talk up your books for you, librarians too.
Yeah. Um, we have one author in our store who, whenever she travels, used to travel, she'd bring 2 or 3 books with her, of her latest book, some cards, some bookmarks, but she would leave them at the terminal at the airport. Have you done anything similar to that?
I did some with like my very first book, and eventually I decided that it's a pretty scattershot approach. It's leaving things out for people to find. It can be kind of fun, but you're really trusting the serendipity. It's much more effective to find the people who want your book already, that are looking for more of this kind of thing.
Do you ever try to target those who aren't looking for your book? Because, like I said, I didn't know a lot about, hardly anything about this genre, and now meeting Harriet, meeting you, Jennifer Estep is going to be with us. And so there's a lot of books now that I'm kind of interested in reading. And so really this has targeted me sort of out of the blue, serendipitously.
Yeah.
Um, what are some of the
But
things that you ever tried to do that or?
not so much because Harriet's a much better marketer than I. Um, no, it's a good. I mean, certainly I have relationships with all of my local indie bookstores. She says she's not, um, but and conferences where readers go, they're going to those conferences to, and to see their favorite authors, but they're also are looking for new authors, and that's one of the most fun things, is to do like a signing or some kind of event at a convention where somebody walks up to your table and says, "You're a new to me author, tell me about your books." And it's like those are the people who are looking.
Right, right. So I haven't delved too much more into your website, but I do see, and I know a lot of authors do trailers for their books. Do you have anything like that on? And we'll talk about this next too. Is your podcast? Do you do anything like trailers on your website or other pages that you have or your social media?
I don't. I did a book trailer, I think, once, and I just didn't think it was very effective. And I've looked at other book trailers over the years, and part of the problem is that it's really hard for us to match the production quality of a Hollywood movie trailer. And I don't think that readers think about books in the same way that when we watch a movie trailer, like we're watching Netflix or something, and we do the trailer to see what the movie's going to be about. There's certain things that we're looking for to decide if we think we might want to watch it. And I don't think that when we look at books that we're looking at the same kind of thing. So I don't do book trailers. I just think that they're not that useful. Maybe
So,
probably other people have had different experiences, but
mhm, mhm. Yeah, we have one author who's done her own trailers for her books. It's a dragon series, Alana Mugden, and she did her own trailers. But she is a filmmaker. She's a screenwriter too, sort of amateur, bordering on amateur professional, and she has this novel series. And she's a musician too. She kind of does a little bit of everything. But yeah, she did her own trailers. They were kind of like digital graphic sort of trailers. But
yeah, if I had those skills, I might be more inclined to do it.
well, you do have the skill with podcasts. Let's talk about your podcast.
Oh, well, so I do my podcast 4 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and it's just 20 minutes where I chat over my first cup of coffee. And so that's why it's called First Cup of Coffee. And I talk about what I'm working on and life in general and publishing and the latest scandal, sort of whatever is on my mind. And it's just a very conversational thing of um, like we're just sitting down to talk over coffee and checking in.
Is it are there comment sections, or are people able to interact, or is it just I'm very technological averse. I mean, I had to do crash courses on all these social medias when we opened the store a few years ago. Never wanted to be on Facebook, and we have a Pinterest. We have all three social medias: Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I even have a Pinterest account. I have no idea how to do it or what it's going to be used for, and I draw the line at TikTok. I am not a video person,
You're
so
not going to do
you will not see
TikTok,
me
huh?
on TikTok.
I'm a little afraid of TikTok too.
So, so podcasts. I kind of wanted to think about doing that, maybe reading from some of our local authors' books and doing that as a podcast. These are definitely I'm trying to get to the YouTube thing, to get these onto YouTube and on our website and stuff. But so I don't know too much about podcasting. So is there a way for people to interact with you or leave comments that you can get to later, or?
Yeah, so I started out the podcast doing audio only. And there are ways, and I cross post to the blog on my website. So people comment on the blog post. And I also post them to Facebook and Twitter, and people comment there. And and then just this last fall, I started doing Instagram Live at the same time as I do the audio. So I'm actually recording on two different devices. And I put the Instagram Live onto IGTV after I save it. But people can comment on there too. They can either comment on the post or they can comment live uh, while I'm talking.
Have you ever thought about doing something long term live, like a half hour show, or I don't know how that would, where people can call in and ask, or like what we're like kind of like what we're doing here, but it's just you talking about whatever the latest thing you want to talk about, but people can call in and talk and or message in and to chat.
I guess not. I am part of a couple of podcast networks and groups, and the thing is that I'm primarily a writer, and so my main focus has to go to writing. I always make sure that's my top priority, so that I can actually get the books written. Um, and so I don't want to get into putting a lot of emphasis on this whole other thing that I'm like trying to make it as good as my book. So I think I probably wouldn't do something like that because the way I can make the podcast work is that it is very casual and off the cuff and it does not have a high production quality.
Hmm.
And it's if it became too much effort, I would stop doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand, because just trying to run the bookstore and all the social media that I have to do along with it. I mean, I don't have to do it, but if I really want to succeed, I kind of have to do it.
Yeah,
And it's a time suck. It takes a lot of time putting the right thing together and getting it on all the platforms.
yeah.
Um, so now to the fun questions. So we touched on this quarter at the beginning. If you were to turn, let's start with, if you were to pick one of your series to turn into, be it a big screen movie or TV series, multi-year, multi-season series, or a Netflix, Hulu short series, or even a long-term series, which which series of your books would you most like to see on the screen?
If for a major motion picture or like an HBO miniseries, I would love to see the Forgotten Empires books. I think that would be great. For multi-season series, I would love to see the whole 12 Kingdoms, Uncharted Realms, Chronicles of Dasnaria. It would braid together really well. It'd be really fun to see that.
Particular channel that you'd like to see that on, just like regular cable TV, or I should say network TV or cable TV, or
Well, I
um,
think it would have to be cable because of my high heat level. I don't think I
true.
could do. I don't think the stories would just totally fall apart. There'd be nothing left. Um, but
Well, I
no,
was gonna
I'm
say, if say NBC comes to you and say, I love your series, we want to make it into, we'll see how long we could go, but make it into a weekly series, would you say, well, see what they have to offer as far as how much they have to cut out because of the heat level, and say yay or nay, or
no, I would probably just take the money.
just there you go.
I mean, because after all, we're paying the mortgage and all of that.
Right.
So, um, I do think that when a writer sells their books to be converted to film, no matter what variety of it, that that the big lesson is that you have to let it go because they are going to change it no matter what. You can look at what happened with A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones,
Mhm.
uh, and you could make yourself crazy trying to stop that from happening. So you have a choice: either you take the money and let it go, or you don't sell it.
So let's say you have network TV offering you the higher amount, but say HBO the lesser amount, but you get more actual representation of your books with the HBO. Which do you think you choose?
Probably, I mean, it would be interesting to see what the financial difference is,
Right.
but probably it's ideal to keep it more original to the source material. So
Hmm.
if I had three different directors competing, I should be so lucky, then I would go with whoever I thought had the closest vision to
Hmm.
what I was doing.
So who is your actresses of choice?
I don't always know, and one of the bad things is I don't have a great brain for names. Um, but the gal who played Brienne of Tarth, Gwen, she just got cast as something interesting too. She's playing in Neil Gaiman's Sandman. See, I'm selective about the names that I can come up
Oh,
with.
okay. Yeah. See,
Yeah,
I'm the same way. I
she's
can't.
gonna play the devil, but she would be great to play my warrior princess and heir to the throne from 12 Kingdoms.
Okay.
I'd love to see that. It's like
Um,
Gwendolyn something.
let's see. Hilary Duff?
No, no.
No, I must be looking at the wrong one then. I don't know.
I can find it. I'm
Yeah.
surprised none of our watchers have popped up
Well,
with
that's
it
kind of,
now.
I'm stalling, hoping that somebody will pipe in, but um, yeah, it's of course my other computer's got like the worst processor in the world.
Uh, I'm looking on IMDb here.
Yeah. Um.
She was also in one of the last Star Wars movies. Okay, I can find this here.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. So
So go ahead.
while
I'm
we're
scrolling.
yeah, while
Gwendolyn
we're
Christie. Gwendolyn Christie.
okay, all right. So what about audiobooks? Have you ever thought about having any of your books turned into, or are they in an audiobook format?
So Forgotten Empires books are in audio. All three will be. And now they popped in. Yeah, you guys were
Yeah.
late. She would make an amazing Ursula, wouldn't she? I would just love to see that. Um, and then for like Carlin, for you guys who know, I think it would be really cool to get someone like Dwayne Johnson to play Harlan. But
Okay.
uh,
Yeah, my wife's a fan of his.
yeah, Jason Momoa. Actually, Jason
Yeah.
Momoa. That I could go back to an earlier one. That was one of the few for the Pages of the Mind. My hero in that Nakoa is absolutely based on Jason Momoa as Aquaman. I saw that image and I was like, I just had to do that.
Now, what are some of your favorite movies? Do you like that science fiction fantasy, superhero type movies, or do you like
Yeah.
more of the romance?
Well, it's hard to find a good romance movie that doesn't get silly. I mean, they did a great job with Bridgertons. I loved Bridgertons. I enjoyed the Outlander series for the first couple seasons. We watched the whole Game of Thrones cycle, which unfortunately ended with a whimper, but liked it for a long time. Uh, and what was I was just thinking of another one, and now it's flown out of my head. A lot of the science fiction movies are really thriller plots that or horror plots that are in that science fiction setting, and so I don't always enjoy that kind of thing.
Hmm. So back to the audiobooks. You were saying that do you have a couple in audiobook format, or is something
Yeah,
you're thinking about?
so this whole series is in audio, and sadly, only the Mark of the Tala is in audio for the 12 Kingdoms because they just like I would love to get those audio rights back because they have done nothing with them. That's just one of the things that you run into with traditional publishing.
Mhm.
A lot of my Covenant of Thorns books are in audio, and a lot of the contemporary and erotic stuff that I did with Karina are in audio.
One of the companies we partner with is an audiobook company in head-to-head competition now with Audible. It's called Libro.fm,
Oh,
and you can get to, and it's something that a lot of people still don't know about, but a lot of people are switching to. And everything that's available through Audible is except those that are exclusive Audible productions, or
right.
there's an exclusivity clause or something um, for one of our writers just ended, so now she's able to put her audiobooks in through and make them available through Libro. But yeah, so you go through our link on our website to get to them, and portions of sales come back to us. So they
Oh,
help
that's
us.
awesome.
They're like a 503c type of profit nonprofit thing. They just changed their
Hmm.
categorization, but same thing with bookshop.org. That's where I found a few of your titles too. So anything that's pretty much available through Ingram is available through bookshop.org. And they 30% of the sale of the book comes back to whose ever store link. So if you use our store link, the total purchase price, we get 30% of that. 10% goes into a general pool for all bookstores, which they give out every 6 months. So we just got that nice little stipend from them.
Nice.
They offer a small discount, but especially if you're really into helping, the independent bookstores, bookshop.org and Libro FM are good things to look into. And
And I
then of
did
course we
set
can.
up a thing on bookshop.org. So,
Oh, good, good.
yeah, a page or whatever it was. Yeah.
Yep, and an affiliate page there. Cool. So trying to think. Oh, so yeah, we're just about, well, we're a little bit over, but I do like to ask, what are you reading now, and what is one sort of guilty pleasure outside of your norm that you read that you didn't think you'd like to read, but it actually, for example, I read Mexican Gothic and wasn't sure about it, but somebody recommended it, had that little bit of supernatural thing into it, so I could give it a try, and I found it phenomenal. I thought it was a
Ah,
great book.
cool.
So it's kind of a guilty pleasure type thing out of the normal sci-fi fantasy that I would generally gravitate to. What are you reading, and then what?
Well, I kind of went into it at the beginning. I've been rereading the Kushel's Legacy series. So, and those are the big door stoppers. They're like 900 pages each. And I am at about 70% through of the third book. So that's been a little bit of an epic read. I'm really enjoying reading that again. As far as something, I don't ever call reading guilty because I'm a big believer that you shouldn't feel guilty about reading.
Mm.
Um, what's something that I've read that was a step outside? I can't think of anything. I read pretty widely. I'm a
Mhm.
pretty eclectic reader, so I just read everything.
Particular time that you read? Do you like to read before bed or during the day, or
Yes.
just kind of there you go. There you go.
I read when I wake up in the morning. I love to, like, for the first 15 minutes or so, just lie there and
Yeah.
read. And then I read like while I'm eating lunch, and I read for a couple hours in the evening usually, and then right before I go to sleep. I read a lot.
Great. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. I want to say thank you for being a part of it. Thank you everybody both on Zoom and on Facebook for joining us. I hope you found it entertaining, enlightening, especially those aspiring writers who are out there. This will be available through our Facebook video section. Don't forget, Jeffe's books are obviously through her website, but also Facebook or bookshop.org. And we can always special order one if you have a particular one that you'd like. We'll eventually get them in the store. There's a lot to get. So we just got to, of course, budget is tight right now, but we'll definitely make an effort to get your books in our store. And if we can ever do when we can start doing in-person events again, you're always welcome to come to the store to do an in-person event with us.
I would love that. I have a very good friend who lives like the next town over from you guys. So,
Oh, great, great.
yeah. Yeah. So I've
So
actually been to that area.
okay, super. Yeah, just give me a call when you're coming, and we'll set something up.
That'd be so
Um,
fun.
so our next one is we're taking a break for a few days, and our next one is next Wednesday with, I believe it's Sydney Ashton, Ashcroft. I keep getting that wrong. Sydney Ashcroft. We have Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and I think we have all 4 days booked up. So hopefully everybody else can join us on those ones as well. You can find that at Facebook, Faro Feb, on their pages too. They're listed there. And again, Jeffe, thank you very much for being a part of this.
Thank you.
and have a good night.
Okay, you too.